Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today's guest has worked for nearly 60 years as an activist and educator. He has worked for racial justice, healthcare, environmental causes, and world peace. He's a board member of Bene, and he'll be speaking at the Campaign Nonviolence National Conference in August, which I will put a link for below in the description so that if you want to come, you can buy a ticket. He is a great inspiration to me, and I'm so honored to have him here. George Martin, thank you so much for being here today.
Well, I'm honored to be here.
Oh, thank you. Um, so I read that your activism began when you were 14 years old,
Yes.
and then when you were 16, you stood right near Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. when he read his I Have a Dream speech. So how do you feel when you reflect on those times and when you see many youth rising up for racial justice now?
I'll tell you, there's a lot in between. There's an awful lot in between. Um, my name is actually George Paz Martin, and Paz is my mother's name, and
Hmm.
it means peace. And so, you know, I grew up within the inner cities and the hearts of our cities, and I grew up in so-called rough neighborhoods, and I always had a foot on both sides of town, kind of. And so, you know, there's so many things connected in terms of racism, militarism, violence, and so with the racism in early on, and you mentioned when I was 14, I uh, I went to the best prep school in the state, and I joined the swimming team and won big time in my first meet, and then went to go to my first practice and was told that I could not practice with my team because they practiced in an all-white facility. I mean, that's a shocker when you're 14 years old,
Yeah.
you know. And so, with the help of some alumni, and whose sons were classmates of mine, we integrated that club in 1 year in getting ready for the next convention. And you know, that's how things happen. Um, yeah, I went to the Great March on Washington unexpectedly because in terms of the integration of that Eagles Club, I was an altar boy, and my parish priest was leading a civil rights activist in the state of Wisconsin. And we disagreed on the desegregation. And he wanted to demonstrate when the national convention came to town. And at 14, I'm saying you're going to wake up the sleeping dogs. We already got this done. But he was an irascible type, and he went ahead with it, and the whole thing fell through.
Mhm.
And so, in my stubbornness, I quit going to church for a bit, and my mother said I had to go. And one night he was parked in front of the house, and my mom saying, "You're going with him, go." And I didn't know what was happening. And I didn't know that we were going to the Great March on Washington. And at 16, it was truly my coming of age in terms of being among all these people who wanted the same things, and all kinds of ages and all kinds of races. So that's a real watermark for me. And I talk about King, in a lot of different venues, and we have an organization here based upon his life around nonviolence, and we work with that in terms of police accountability and also racial justice here, and support of those who carry on his values. So it's become a big part of me since that actual circumstantial moment when I ended up pretty close to him when he gave the "I Have a Dream" speech. Yeah. And so as we talk about youth today, uh, toward the end, you ask if I'm involved in a project that I'm really excited about.
Mhm.
And so right now I'm in the midst of an article that I've been asked to write on the Black Lives Matter movement, and also how it ties into this whole triple
Mhm.
situation that's impacted the Black community, the pandemic with the high percentages, and also the economic impact in terms of unemployment.
Mhm.
But, in working with this, I get back to, I called myself passing the torch a decade ago, and have been working in training. So it's really wonderful to see 11-hour marches going on with no violence,
Mhm.
you know, and kind of like in Dave Chappelle's words, but I don't like his comedy. But his word is, the young people are driving, and I'm riding in the back seat. And I'm loving that, and I'm loving that, and we're out there, and we're high risk in terms of the pandemic, but we're in our car, you know, and we have maximum contact, but we're out there in support of,
Mhm.
and so it's all good. And I also understand many of the kind of negative things that are implied because of my years working against racism and working against the Ku Klux Klan and
Mhm.
the Nazis in organizing, you know,
Yeah.
you know, and so I understand, the whole situation of out of town groups and oftentimes where violence comes from. You know, I'm the former national co-chair of United for Peace and Justice during the Iraq War. 1,400 organizations. I did that for 8 years. So major organizing. So we go back to the pond at Washington D.C. where with King we had, 200,000. I've organized there for 500,000 a couple times, and I don't think I could have had the foresight of the feeling or the courage to do kind of things I've done if I hadn't been there when I was 16 years old.
Mhm.
And I do have the benefit of having spent a little time with King later on, a month before he was assassinated.
Wow.
And so as we talk about this whole thing and violence, there's kind of, you know, we see frustration, we see things happening, we see some destruction, kind of put it in context.
Mhm.
And also within this movement, seeing the people of the movement trying to stop that violence and saying, this is not what we want, and we don't want you marching with us with guns, go somewhere else, you know. But that's all the kind of standing up that I'm very proud to see, you know. And another thing that's so important is that it's so decentralized. That doesn't mean just young leaders. That means thousands of young leaders, and that's super, you know. So we're at this point where, during the last couple of weeks since sadly the death of George Floyd, you
Mhm.
know, the movement has grown in 2 weeks in terms of Black Lives Movement as much as it grew in 2 years. And as a trainer, when we talk about training around movement building, whether it's healthcare, whether it's against the war, or whether it's women's issues, there's a whole sophistication in history in terms of how you get to the top and when you get to the top and what you do. Well, this is certainly at the top, you know. And the Black Lives Movement, who would have thought it before, has more credibility than the President of the United States, you know, that it is so global in terms of people of color in the African diaspora saying that happened to my brother and I live in Africa. I live in Paris and that happened to my cousin, you know, or talking to a black police officer and him saying that we killed my brother, you know. So it's got so many deeper implications. And, in some conversations I've been in, there's been that, oh, you hated to see the violence, and at the same time, you know, I do understand it. And
Mhm.
I do understand that oftentimes they're provocateurs,
Mhm.
people who aren't a part of the movement, who are there just to cause trouble. And they can come from the authority side, and they can come from whatever you want to call them, Antifa, anarchists, whatever you want to call, whatever they want to call themselves, Boogaloo. But at the same time, it's been a real serious part of our work as organizers and activists to separate that from us so that our message is heard. And I think the message has been loud and clear now, and it's a good time. The issue is, where do we go from here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
And then my next question I'd love to ask is, I know that you've studied nonviolence your whole life, and so I would like to know, what does nonviolence mean to you?
Oh. It can mean so many things, especially when you've seen that violence.
Mhm.
I was in Baghdad 2 days after shock and awe, and I saw the suffering, the wounds, and the divisions, and when you know how life can be, you know, and whether that violence is domestic violence and it's one person or it's 500,000 kids, you know, whether it's physical, whether it's verbal and mental, whether it's economic,
Mhm.
you know. So as we've learned over time, almost everything is connected. Almost everything is connected, and so therefore, as we work and we work on the principles of nonviolence and democracy, you know, it's pretty concrete.
Mhm.
And so in terms of working on those principles, this whole Black Lives Matter movement gives a lot of hope. And it gives a lot of hope to see what governments are doing so quickly that took so long. You know, uh, to understand that there's not an federal anti-lynching bill in this country. And out of our peace group, I'll be showing on Zoom. We'll be showing a movie called on lynching and having a discussion after that. But as a black person, contrary to a lot of people I grew up with, I grew up looking at that in terms of black publications since I was 5 years old. It was something that I saw new every week, and understood. And then when it was about 10 years ago, the FBI came out to say that it's never stopped since the Civil War. We just didn't understand all of it, and then working with the NAACP, understanding what's happened around our military bases, you know, and so as we talk about that violence, mainstream, as Dr. King always talked about, was militarism, you know, and I had the good fortune to be at a rally in Ferguson, within the year of the tragedy there, and spoke with the new police chief, and the whole concept of, and it doesn't make you bad if you're former military. And I've served homeless veterans for 40 years, and I still do. But I asked him the question if he was former military, and he said, yeah. And I said, well, what about your force? And he said, well, a lot. I said, probably 85%. And he said, yeah. And I said, we all understand PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, should be post-traumatic stress normalities of war. And war makes good men and women bad, you know. And so that whole significance of that state of mind after trauma. And I simply put it to him, do you screen heavily when you hire? Do you do regular periodic analysis in terms of where your people stand? They're your people. You know, do you understand? I'm sure you understand the significance of domestic violence. How much is perpetrated by your own policemen on their wives and their children? You know, and then what happens when they get in the street? And then that you have a responsibility to make sure that people who get in the street to serve are of a good mind to serve. And that comes back to that stream of violence, and also training, but being accountable and changing it and moving people on if they don't. So I could go on and on about this, but the whole connection in terms of where we are today and what needs to be changed, and this spike of racism that does drive violence. And so, it can be scary, but at the same time, the bad stories get a lot of the exposure, but there's so many good stories, and then we have to live off those good stories, and we have to grow those good stories, and that's what we're doing out of Pache Bene.
That's right. And that's why I'm so grateful to be a part of this organization, even just for the summer. Um, and then you kind of talked about this a bit earlier, but I would love to hear more. Can you tell me about a project that you're working on right now that you're really excited about?
Yeah, yeah, and I mentioned I published it time to times, but I'll tell you, when people ask me to write, to be published, I just love it. And it's about home here, and it's about the kind of work I've been involved in. And I was asked to write because of my previous articles along the lines of police accountability and racism, you know. And so, as I dig it into it all the more, to see the continuity across this country. You know, the Congressional Black Caucus came up with great points, and as I lecture on police accountability, they hit all my points, and I'm saying yay, for once. And people need to understand we have 18,000 separate police jurisdictions in this country, all independent, with no federal oversight. There was some over Obama, and here in Milwaukee, because of the history, we fought for the patterns and practices review by the federal government for 7 years, and then Trump dropped it all. You know, and so we have the same kind of root problems that we've had almost darn near forever here. So this is an opportunity. This is the real opportunity, and it's hot. And it's like, where do we go from here with this? How do we change things? There's good examples. You can talk about defunding, but you can talk about reimagining. And I'll tell you, a police officer's job is really difficult. You know, and just to deal with the criminal side of it, but domestic violence, mental health, homelessness, other things, their own stability, and so that job shouldn't be all of that. And that's why we're talking about reimagining, taking money from that job, knocking down the job description, slimming it down, and giving money to mental health, giving it to education, putting more in social work, reimagining in terms of that call about domestic violence. Who comes to the door, and do they come with a gun in their hand? But all this can make for a better world. So it's a real opportunity, and there are communities in this country who have done that. And a tough part of it, is and I'll tell you, in terms of my work, many a police officer has said, like, George, you're doing the right thing. We got to get rid of these bad guys. They'll come out and say that, But at the same time, it's been perpetuated so much. You can talk about there being a bad apple in the barrel. But if that apple has been able to survive, if it's been able to strive, if it's been able to grow, that means that there's something wrong with that barrel. And that barrel extends to the district attorneys who do not prosecute officers. They work with them in terms of criminal justice, but they can't be the ones to monitor and investigate them in terms of their own crimes. That's a conflict of interest. We looked at the grand jury system, we look at judges, but I also forgot, in my research, I came across this the other day. The coroners in this country, and we get a lot of, it was suicide. Two guys hung, in the middle of time. It was suicide. Or, it was drugs. Or it was sickle cell anemia that he couldn't breathe. And that's thrown out has nothing to do with Black ethnicity, and being, and I can't breathe, But we look at all that and we find out that 80% of the coroners in this country have been coerced by supervisors to give a wrong autopsy. And it just fits into the whole system. So it's like, we can't reform this. We got to break it down and start all over again. And it'll be so much better when we do. Yeah. So, that's the kind of layers I'm getting into here. And also the economics, the pandemic and its disproportionate effect on people of color, and then the economic impact in terms of layoffs disproportionately on people of color again. So we're hitting a triple thing right here, 3 layers, and so it's a chance to solve more than a few things at one time. Right. And it's our hope that for once Congress can work across this aisle, and it's our hope that also people turn out in November to change things.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Oh, well, thank you so much, George.
Well, you're welcome.
It's just been wonderful to talk to you, and I'm just so grateful. Thank you.
Well, welcome to the family. We have a good family.
Thank you.
I'd like to end with the motto
Yes.
of my tribe in Ghana, a 5,000-year-old tribe of the Ashanti Nation. And our motto for 5,000 years has been peace and love.
Oh,
Thank you.
thank you.